This is BBC News. The headlines. The EU says it is to hold an emergency summit on Thursday to discuss the threat of tariffs on countries opposed to its plan to take over Greenland. Coming up, a BBC Your Voice special. We've got an expert panel on hand to answer all your questions, what it means militarily, economically, politically for the future of the transatlantic alliance. Over the next half an hour, we are going to attempt to answer all the questions you've sent us on Greenland and the row that is brewing between the Europeans and the United States. We have that expert panel with us to answer those questions. In Brussels, our Europe correspondent Nick Beake. In Washington, Helena Humphrey. And here in London, Sophia Gaston, who is a visiting fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being with us. We're going to start with this question from Sandra Christie, 76 years old in Chester, who really sums up what everybody is thinking. Donald Trump is saying he needs to take over Greenland to ensure the security of the United States. Nick, isn't that what Putin said about Ukraine?
Hi, Christian. Well, I tell you what, Sandra has got a point. President Putin made a number of arguments. He was saying that Ukraine had to be part of Russia for military reasons, economic reasons. He was making a cultural argument. All these reasons he put forward for Ukraine being part of Russia. He also said, it's worth stressing, that there would not be any military invasion of Ukraine. And I can remember being back in Kyiv in 2022, that morning when the sirens went off, the explosions started to ring out across the city, and it became clear that President Putin had been lying and there was a full-scale invasion underway. In terms of Greenland, undoubtedly, it's taking on added strategic importance, and there is a debate about the security of the place. We know the ice is melting. We know that that means that more ships are able to access lanes that have previously been frozen. And for China, for example, it's a much quicker route of getting goods from one part of the world to another. But there is a feeling that President Trump has really overblown the security threat. I was in Copenhagen last year, Christian, and we were talking to military analysts, experts there, and they were saying in terms of Russian and Chinese military ships being around Greenland, that simply wasn't the case. So there is a feeling they would say that President Trump is not right there. I think they'd also make the point that under the current existing arrangement, the Americans can basically put as many troops as they want on Greenland. They can build new bases. They could call one of them Fort Trump, base Trump, whatever they wanted to do. And they have got at their disposal that sort of power to boost security there. And in recent years, the Americans have been removing their own troops from Greenland.
Sophia, just on that point, do you see any difference between the Trump arguments and the arguments that President Putin was making about Ukraine?
Well, obviously, it's very alarming for an American president to be talking about acquiring a NATO ally's territory. But I do think that they are quite different scenarios. President Putin was seeking his imperial expansion into Ukraine, which really was not just about obtaining Ukraine's territory, but the cultural erasure of the Ukrainian people and their identity, their national identity. And this was all in his objective to reform the Soviet Union, which he saw the collapse of as he described it, the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. So I do think that President Trump's ambitions here are more about sovereign control and territorial expansion rather than any kind of cultural objective. And certainly, I think the fact that the Greenlandic people are there is sort of considered incidental for him, whereas actually sort of absorbing the Ukrainian people into this Russian super ethno-state was a core part of Putin's objectives. He did also, President Putin, portray Ukraine as a direct active military threat to Russia. And that certainly isn't the case in the way in which Trump is dealing with Greenland.
Helena, Stephen in Preston asks, will Donald Trump launch a special military operation to take Greenland?
Well, special military operation, of course, is directly that language that President Putin used, didn't he, when he launched that full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Were he to do that, let's be clear about it, it would be absolutely seismic. And I think one thing we can take from President Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is accurately predicting that. It caught out even some of the best experts in this field, but it certainly would be seismic, not least because this would be an attack against a NATO member. And so often we talk about Article 5, don't we? An attack against one is an attack against all. And essentially what you would see is NATO entirely upended, with two NATO allies essentially then locked in a confrontation. So I'm not going to make an absolute hard and fast prediction on all of that, but let's take a look at Donald Trump's rhetoric in this. He has said that this can be done the easy way. He's talking about an acquisition, which would be very costly, essentially buying Greenland, or it can be done the hard way. There's that rhetoric there with the threat of military force. But let's take a look at the political backdrop to all of this, what people here in the United States are talking about. And this isn't very popular among the electorate right now, particularly when you've got those midterm elections coming up. And if you take a look at recent polling, what are people talking about here? They're talking about affordability. They're talking about the economy. Not to mention, although this may make Donald Trump look kind of tough with his MAGA base, he also came back into power with this second term, presenting a less interventionist approach when it comes to foreign policy. So certainly I think it's fair to say that it wouldn't be a popular move at home.
Well, Sam from Pittsburgh asks an aligned question to that, Eleanor. He says, no other president of the United States has ever been concerned about Greenland. Why is Donald Trump, and why now?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, when you look at Greenland, just geographically, of course, strategically, it is very important. It is very valuable as well. I mean, we're talking about the world's largest island. Donald Trump and the Trump administration have made the case that this is about national security, essentially saying, if we're not there, well, there is the threat of Russia, there is the threat of China. And you've seen this pushback coming from Greenland, coming from Denmark, saying, well, no, we don't see eye to eye on that same Arctic risk. And if there is that argument, well, let us be the ones to reinforce security. NATO member states, for example, then putting people onto the island and then provoking this ire of Donald Trump. Other critics have said, look at Greenland, look at how untapped it is in terms of these rare earth minerals, which can be used in a tech sector, in defence sectors, and perhaps you are starting to get a little bit closer to why Donald Trump is seeing it as quite so important. The other thing I think that's really interesting in all of this is the climate change angle. And Nick was mentioning this, wasn't he? The fact that you've got this ice melting means that you've got these shipping routes that are increasingly becoming accessible that weren't accessible before. But of course, at the same time, Donald Trump has pulled out of climate organisations, climate treaties, including the Paris climate agreements. So you've got some kind of tacit acknowledgement there of this world that is heating up, whilst at the same time pulling out of climate accords. Just some of the factors which perhaps are making Greenland look rather attractive to President Trump.
Sophia, a lot of our viewers are asking questions about the rules-based order. S. Smith in Manchester asked this: how is this and the Venezuela incident any different than Russia and the Ukraine, or China and Taiwan, or Israel and Gaza? It's another government taking over other countries from some sort of gain. Trump is as dangerous as Putin, question mark.
Well, I wouldn't make that comparison. I do just want to actually push back on a couple of things that have been said so far. The first is plenty of other American presidents have actually expressed an interest in Greenland. It has been subject to American scrutiny for quite some time, and that's why there was this pact that was thrashed out between Denmark and the United States after the Second World War, because it was, even at that time, of paramount American importance.
This is the 1951 pact, isn't it, that they signed, which gives America the power to send as many troops as they want.
Exactly. And I also would emphasize that the security dimensions here are really substantive. And perhaps even more than that, the geostrategic, geoeconomic dimensions of Greenland are very important. We have a lot of, there's access to satellites and so on, which can only be made through there. There's a lot of undersea nuclear submarine routes and also these shipping lanes. So there's quite a few areas in which this is actually extremely important. So
does it follow that NATO couldn't do that job? I mean, would it be more secure, as he suggests, if it were American?
Donald Trump regards Greenland as part of America's front line in its defense, right? And the thing about alliances with the Trump administration is he does actually believe in the concept of alliances, but he does not want any part of America's frontline security to be dependent on them. And we have to say that in Europe, we unfortunately have underinvested in security in the whole European region and also in the Arctic and High North. And so when he looks at the European NATO allies saying, well, actually, what's the problem? We're here, we're all partners in this together. He doesn't actually believe that we can offer any kind of credible defense of Greenland. So he really wants...
How about this question then from Sally Hobson in Shaftesbury, Dorset? She says, if he has serious concerns about Greenland's security, why doesn't he send more troops? There are still only 100 US personnel on Greenland. Surely this doesn't truly reflect his concerns.
Because this goes back to his view of alliances. He has a very strong belief in the concept that all countries will act in their own sovereign interest. And for him, that always injects a degree of ambiguity into how any ally will react when there is an American request for assets, instruments, and so on, mobilization in support of US goals, which is why he wants complete sovereign control. He wants total flexibility. Now, of course, that's baffling for us in Europe because we have time and time again over the last 100 years shown America that we will show up whenever they ask of them. And obviously, famously after 9/11, we sent thousands of people, and shed a lot of blood in the Middle East in pursuit of American goals. So I think for us, it seems baffling, but this is just a fundamentally different worldview that the Trump administration has. And I think this is partly why Washington and the European capitals are just talking past each other.
Nick, before we go to a short break, what about the European response? Duncan Lawler in Portsmouth asks, why doesn't Europe just send a large force over to Greenland? We need to stick with our European neighbours here. Trump is a danger to the world. Why are they sending so few troops if there is a threat that America might land there?
Yeah, good question. I'll tell you what, in the last few minutes, Christian, I've seen reports in the Danish media that they are sending what they describe as a substantial contribution of troops to Greenland. I mean, it's got to be said, this is not some sort of change of policy, this big departure from what they've been doing previously. This is all part of this Arctic endurance operation, this training involving NATO allies that's going to be taking place. But yeah, in terms of Europe sending more troops to Greenland, the direction of travel so far has been that troops have been moving away from that island, certainly in the case of the Americans. In the case of Europe, we've seen the size of many armies diminish. And if you look at Poland, a country that per person spends a lot on its military, the big preoccupation for them is Russia, of course, just on their doorstep. So competing things that people need to deal with for European leaders to contemplate. And so far, there hasn't been a big push to send lots of troops to Greenland, certainly not since the conversation that President Trump has now reignited once again.
Nick Beake in Brussels, thank you very much for that. We're going to take a short break. We've got plenty more questions to get into. We'll be right back after this short break. Back to your questions answered. We've got Sophia Gaston, Nick Beake and Helena Humphreys answering all your questions that you've sent in to us. Helena Humphrey, the question here from Wendy Jameson-Franks from Sussex. Why has President Trump not been told that Greenland is protected by NATO, which includes the United States? He has no reason to own it. Does he have no faith in NATO at all?
Well, I think, of course, Wendy, this is something that Donald Trump knows. He will have been reminded on many occasions, not least by NATO member states. But that doesn't stop him putting out this maximalist position, does it? And if we take historically a view of what Donald Trump has had to say about NATO, you can see that often he takes this maximalist position essentially in some kind of bid to push negotiations. Think, for example, his whole scepticism over NATO when it comes to defence spending from NATO member states, for example. He was very displeased with the amount that Europeans had been paying out and wanted them to significantly up their contributions, which he did. So I think from Donald Trump, we know that the rhetoric often starts from a tough position, a maximalist position. This is someone who prides himself on the art of the deal, and with some ambiguity as well. We had comments over the weekend when Donald Trump was on Truth Social saying that this was all about buying Greenland, and perhaps there was a sigh of relief there from some European capitals thinking, well, OK, this is about buying as opposed to military force. And then, of course, we all wake up and we see this letter to the Norwegian Prime Minister saying that Donald Trump is angry he hasn't been awarded the Peace Prize. And because of that, he says that he doesn't really feel obliged to think about peace anymore. And then suddenly European capitals are scrambling once again, thinking, well, could the military position still be on the table? So we know that Donald Trump is aware of the conventions of NATO, but we also know that he's a leader who doesn't always pay attention to the status quo, who has scepticism when it comes to the world order and these organisations, and is never shy, essentially, of putting out a maximalist demand and seeing what he gets back in return.
Sophia, there is a question here from Simon Hyatt in Cardiff, which again relates to the pre-existing agreements that we've talked about, the 1951 agreement, which already allows the American government to deploy as many troops as it wishes. And Simon asks, if this is true, why is this not being addressed and used more fervently as a counter-argument?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the president's position here is actually not about working with NATO partners to increase the security presence in the region. It's about America having full sovereign control over Greenland, which they see as one of the front lines of their defense. So I think that is part of the reason why the Europeans have come to understand that making that argument over and over again is actually not going to get them anywhere, because the president's motivations are just fundamentally different. And I think that the challenge here is it's very difficult to think about what the off-ramps are at this point. I mean, I personally think that if Europe had invested considerably more in Arctic and high north defences over the last few years, and even just over the last year since Trump came back into office, I think that we would have been in a much better position to convey ourselves as partners rather than, as President Trump currently sees us, as vulnerable dependents on US security. Now, I think it's very important to contextualize this whole conversation within these negotiations that are ongoing about Ukraine, because the very strong message that Donald Trump has received over the past year is that Europe remains very, very stretched in being able to militarily support Ukraine, and that we are very consumed with all the resources required to do that. And in fact, we remain dependent on several really core functions from the United States. So the president is under no illusions about just how depleted our resources are. So this is the problem. We're going into this conversation with very, very little practical leverage aside from these conventions, international law, and the things that we sort of like to really hold up as the pillars of the rules-based order. And we're dealing then with a president who really understands power through raw economic and military capabilities. So,
the second part of Simon's question, Helena, is about the economic element to this. Is it about Trump's desire to own this country based on the extraction of rich mineral assets, oil, and, of course, his overinflated ego that surrounds all that? I mean, he's asking, is it really about the security? Because there are no Chinese and Russian ships there at the moment. There is no security threat right now. Is it more about what is there that he doesn't want to lose to the other great powers?
Well, on that prospect of security, Christian, when we had the delegations, the Greenlandic and Danish delegation here last week for those conversations, those difficult meetings at the White House, there was this accusation from President Trump, as we've heard in the past, that when it comes to remote regions in the Arctic, all you've got there essentially is what he said were 2 dog sleds patrolling the region. And the pushback that came from the Danes and from the Greenlandic minister was, you can always deploy more people there, more troops to patrol. We will patrol and we will put more troops there, as will other EU countries. But you too can. It's gone from, as we mentioned, around 1,500 troops from the 50s onwards to around 150 today. And then, of course, what we saw over the weekend, this Danish military exercise, and that really provoked that backlash, that anger from Donald Trump. So people are saying, well, which option is it that you want? Do you want us to protect this island, or is it about something more than that? Is it about these valuable earth minerals? I mean, I've spoken to people, including the former ambassador to Denmark during the Trump administration, Carla Sands, and she acknowledged, yes, this is an incredibly wealthy island when it comes to those rare earth minerals. And when you look at critics of the Trump administration with Venezuela, for example, as well, where people have also been pointing to that oil deal, which they quickly spoke about following the ouster of Nicolas Maduro, people will say, well, this is also what the Trump administration is looking at. But I think the Trump administration has not necessarily concealed the fact that it is looking for economic deals as well.
Yeah, he's just been asked if he would use force to seize Greenland, and he said no comment. There is also another line here, Nick, from the US Speaker Mike Johnson, who is in London, in Downing Street at the moment, asked if the special relationship was still special. He responded, very special, yes. There's a question here from Kieran Hancock's in Yarm, Stockton-on-Tees, who says, Keir Starmer said during the press conference this morning that our nuclear deterrent is reliant on the United States. Is there a possibility the US would stop providing the nuclear warheads? And if so, where would that leave Britain?
Well, I think that's a direction that the British don't want to think about at this point. Interesting, Christian, you raised that phrase that we hear so often, the special relationship. It's almost like we're waiting for it to be uttered by a British Prime Minister or an American President. I didn't hear Sir Keir Starmer use that phrase this morning. Now, are we in a new phase of the relationship between the US and the UK? But certainly, if we go back to the question, the idea of America withdrawing its support militarily when it comes to the most severe of circumstances involving a nuclear deterrent, that's something that doesn't want to be, they just don't want to think about this at this point. We've seen certainly how the Americans, President Trump specifically, has withdrawn military support for Ukraine, as well as his political support over the past year or so. It's ebbed and flowed whether or not he's given support to President Zelensky or whether he's withdrawn it. So, I mean, certainly that is something which would be a huge concern if it became a more pressing issue. If this disagreement between the US
that we've had an anonymous
and Europe.
We've had an anonymous question here from Norfolk, Nick, which you maybe answered it. He says, if Trump imposes tariffs on his allies, then why cannot Europe and our allies impose export sanctions on all American products and services at 25%? I think the mood music today we've heard from all sides in Europe is they don't want to escalate for those very reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they can, though, Christian, can't they? And President Macron of France has been talking about using this trade bazooka, which basically was a weapon that the EU came up with a couple of years ago. The idea was that if the EU was being bullied by a hostile external power, then they could fight back with their own countermeasures. Of course, they were thinking of China then. not the United States. But I think the risk is that Europe becomes split if this is a row that escalates, because the Germans have indicated they may well be thinking the same sort of thing as President Macron. Giorgia Meloni of Italy saying we have to take a diplomatic path here. This really needs to de-escalate.
We are out of time. Thank you for all the questions that you sent. Please do keep continuing to send these questions. We'll do another of these sessions and get some of them answered for you. Just to say thank you to Helena Humphrey, thank you to Nick B, and also Sophia Gaston. Good to have your company. We're going to take a short break. Headlines are coming up.